She laughed at her poor neighbor, called her house a ruin, and considered herself superior to everyone else. But when a fire destroyed everything she had, not a single friend would let her stay even for one night. And then the door was opened by the one she had once despised. Look at what this woman did and how it changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The first snow had come earlier than anyone in the valley expected. It powdered the roofs and hedges with quiet precision, like someone laying down a clean sheet to hide the earth's imperfections. In the center of it all stood Clara Mason's house, a place that had long been the envy of her neighbors. Its white fence gleamed even in the gray light, the shutters painted a deep, disciplined blue. Nothing around it ever looked unplanned. The gravel path had been measured to the inch, the potted shrubs trimmed in perfect symmetry. Clara liked to say that beauty was the result of good accounting, and she treated her home as if it were a balance sheet that always had to end in her favor. Her mornings followed the same rhythm every day. The alarm would ring at 6:30 sharp. She would rise, put on her robe, and make her coffee 1 sugar, no milk. While the coffee brewed, she opened her planner, checking her schedule for the day, sometimes underlining tasks twice for the satisfaction of order. Then she'd walk to the window and survey the yard, making sure the neighbor's dog hadn't left prints on her snow, that the mail was placed correctly in the box, that the world was, at least within her small domain, properly contained. Clara worked as a bookkeeper for a transport company in town. It was not a glamorous job, but it suited her nature. She enjoyed numbers because they behaved. They could be arranged and balanced, corrected when wrong. People, on the other hand, could not. People disappointed, forgot, resisted correction. So she kept her circle small, an older brother who lived 3 towns away, 2 women she occasionally had lunch with, and a polite but distant set of neighbors who admired her roses but rarely invited her for coffee. That distance did not bother her. It gave her room to breathe and to keep her life clean, like the spotless countertops of her kitchen. There was, however, one person she had never been able to ignore completely: Agnes Harding. The old woman lived at the edge of the settlement, beyond the last paved road, in a house that seemed to have grown straight out of the mountain itself. To Clara, it looked more like a cave than a dwelling. The roof sloped unevenly, swallowed by stone and moss. In the winter, smoke poured from its chimney in thick black ribbons that stained the snow. Whenever Clara walked past on her way to the market, she would wrinkle her nose at the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. It offended her sense of neatness. "She lives like it's the 19th century," Clara once told Marjorie, her friend and occasional confidant. "I don't understand how anyone can live in a place like that. Dark, cold, primitive. You'd think she would have the sense to move to an apartment." Marjorie had only smiled. "She's happy, I think. Some people like quiet." "Quiet is one thing," Clara replied, folding her arms. "But that's a monument to neglect." And that had been the end of it. Clara never visited the stone house, though she often saw Agnes walking through the snow with a basket of logs on her back or a pail of water in her hand. Her movements were slow but steady, her eyes alert beneath the woolen scarf that framed her lined face. There was always something stubbornly alive about her, as if the cold itself had accepted that she would not yield to it. The irony was that Clara prided herself on being strong, too, but her strength was of a different kind, brittle, like glass polished too often. She liked the feeling of control, the certainty that every object in her life had a place, every task a check mark. She even kept her grief organized. When her husband, Leonard, had died 10 years ago from a sudden heart attack, she'd allowed herself exactly 1 week of tears. After that, she packed away his clothes, donated his books, and resumed her routines. People called her brave, but it wasn't bravery. It was fear of what might happen if she ever let the disorder in. That December, as the days grew shorter and the cold deepened, Clara began preparing for Christmas. She didn't expect visitors, but she decorated anyway. A tree, perfectly symmetrical, stood in the living room. She wrapped the lights herself, making sure they spiraled evenly. The ornaments were arranged by color. Her home glowed with artificial warmth, every candle in its designated holder. Outside, the wind whistled through the birches, scattering flakes against the window panes. Clara sat by the fire and looked out at the night. Across the valley, far beyond the last streetlight, she could see a faint orange gleam Agnes's house. The chimney was smoking again, curling into the sky like an old breath. For reasons she couldn't name, that small light irritated her. It made her house feel sterile, too perfect, too quiet. She turned away and adjusted the firewood in her own hearth, convincing herself that her warmth was cleaner, more civilized. The next morning she noticed the ceiling light flicker. It happened twice, then steadied. She frowned and made a note to call an electrician after the holidays. Later that evening, as she cooked her dinner, the radio cut off for a second before returning with static. She sighed. "Cheap wiring," she muttered. But she didn't call anyone. The snow was heavy, and the roads were poor. There was always time later. That night the storm worsened. The wind howled against the siding, and the trees creaked under their icy burden. Around midnight, Clara awoke to a faint crackling sound. At first she thought it was the storm, branches scraping the window. Then came the smell. Sharp, acrid, unmistakable. Smoke. She sat up in bed, heart racing. The hallway outside her room glowed an eerie orange. When she opened the door, a wave of heat rushed at her face. The wall socket near the stairs was spitting sparks, flames crawling up the wallpaper. She grabbed the nearest thing, a towel, and tried to beat it down. But the fire had already found the drapes. The air thickened, heavy with burning paint. Panic clawed up her throat. She stumbled to the kitchen, searching for water. But the flames were faster, licking across the ceiling, crackling like dry laughter. She ran to the front door, barefoot, coughing. The cold outside struck her like a slap, snow biting into her skin. Behind her, the fire roared, alive and greedy. Windows burst with muffled pops, and the roof began to glow. She could see her own reflection in the glass for a moment, pale, terrified, hair loose and wild, and then the window shattered, scattering shards across the snow. Neighbors began to appear, wrapped in coats and scarves. Someone shouted her name. Someone else called the fire department. But all Clara could do was stand and watch as everything she had built, every object she had polished and arranged, was devoured by the flames. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. The smoke rose into the storm, a dark column twisting among the falling snowflakes. When the firefighters finally arrived, it was too late. The fire had done its work well. The walls collapsed inward, hissing under the spray of water. Steam rose where moments ago her kitchen had been. One of the men approached her with a blanket, draping it over her shoulders, but she barely felt it. Her hands trembled, empty, useless. Marjorie came, breathless and frightened, her boots sinking into the slush. "Clara, come with me. You can stay at my place tonight." Clara nodded without speaking. Her throat hurt from the smoke. She looked once more at the ruins, the perfect house, the pride of the street, and something inside her cracked quietly, though she didn't realize it then. It wasn't just the house that had burned. It was the illusion that order could protect her from life. As the firefighters packed their hoses and the neighbors drifted away, the valley fell silent again. The snow thickened, covering the blackened remains, smoothing them over, as if the fire had never happened. Across the field, The faint glow of another house shone through the storm, the same golden light that had always annoyed her, now the only warm thing left in sight. She turned her eyes away, clutching the blanket closer, and followed Marjorie into the night, not knowing that the path she'd begun that evening would lead her back to that very light, and to the woman she had once scorned. It was the first time in her life that Clara Mason had nothing left to control. And in the freezing air, beneath the whispering snow, she felt both terrified and strangely alive. The wind carried the scent of smoke and pine, a promise and a warning all at once. Somewhere behind her, the ruins of her perfect home hissed quietly, steam rising like the breath of something that refused to die. She did not look back again. The smell of smoke clung to her skin long after the fire was out. For days, even the cold air seemed to carry a trace of what she had lost, as though the ashes of her house followed her wherever she went. The morning after the fire, Clara sat on the edge of a borrowed bed in a small-town motel. The walls were beige and thin, the radiator hissed weakly, and a single snow-covered window looked out onto the parking lot. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flames again, orange tongues licking the ceiling, the windows glowing from within, the way her curtains had turned to black lace in seconds. It was a sound more than a sight that haunted her, the roar, the living hunger of it, and the silence afterward. She sipped the watery coffee from the vending machine and stared at her reflection in the mirror across the room. Her face looked older. Her eyes, once sharp and alert, now seemed lost in a fog. For a woman who prided herself on order, she was surrounded by chaos. A borrowed coat, a melted phone charger, documents half burnt and sealed in a plastic bag. Even her handbag smelled of soot. When the insurance company called, she answered with a mechanical politeness, agreed to sign the forms, and hung up before the agent could offer sympathy. She didn't need comfort, she told herself. She needed structure. Marjorie insisted she move in with her until the repairs could begin. "It's only for a few weeks," her friend had said, placing a warm hand on Clara's shoulder. "You need people around you." Clara had nodded, grateful in theory but uneasy in practice. Marjorie's house was warm and bright, filled with the smell of cinnamon and laundry soap, but the moment Clara stepped through the door, she felt like an intruder. There were children's drawings on the fridge, mismatched mugs, a pile of mail on the counter. The disarray made her skin prickle. She tried to smile through dinner, complimenting the stew, helping to clear the plates. But later, when everyone was asleep, she found herself quietly rearranging the items on the kitchen shelf, aligning the salt and pepper shakers, folding a dish towel more neatly. It calmed her briefly. The next morning, Marjorie noticed. "You don't have to tidy everything," she said gently. "Just rest, Clara." Clara smiled stiffly. "It's no trouble. I can't sit still when things are out of place." Marjorie hesitated, then gave a small laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "All right. Just don't wear yourself out." But by the third day, something had shifted. Clara caught the faint impatience in Marjorie's tone, the way she sighed when Clara commented about leaving shoes by the door, the way she looked at her when she corrected the children for making noise. It wasn't anger, just discomfort, the same kind Clara herself had felt so many times around others. By evening, Clara announced that she would go stay with another acquaintance, Cindy, who lived closer to town. Marjorie tried to protest, but Clara insisted. "You have your family," she said. "I don't want to impose." The truth was, she couldn't bear to be where life moved freely, where mess and laughter mingled without permission. She packed her things, thanked Marjorie for her kindness, and left before dawn. Cindy, a co-worker from the office, greeted her with sympathy and tea. "Stay as long as you need," she said. and at first Clara felt relief. But the relief didn't last. Cindy was younger, spontaneous, fond of music and scented candles. Her apartment smelled like vanilla and played soft jazz in the evenings. To Clara, it felt intolerably cluttered. The first night, she turned down the radio volume. The next, she opened a window because of the heavy air. She offered to organize the pantry and suggested labeling the spice jars. Cindy laughed politely, but her smile thinned. By the second morning, Clara sensed it, the shift, the polite distance, the unspoken wish that she would move on. She knew the signs. They were the same ones she had shown others for years. The too careful smile, the glance at the clock, the gentle excuse. "I'm just so busy with work this week," Cindy said, almost apologetically. "You understand, right?" Clara nodded, pretending not to feel the sting. "Of course. I was planning to make other arrangements anyway." She didn't make any. She simply left, suitcase in hand, stepping out into the brittle sunlight of a town that no longer felt familiar. The cold bit through her gloves. She thought of calling her brother, but the thought of explaining, of asking for help, filled her with shame. She had been the strong one, the organized one, the woman who always had a plan. Now she was the one knocking on doors that would not open. For a few nights she stayed in a cheap hostel near the edge of town. The walls there were stained with old smoke, and the bed creaked whenever she turned. The hallway smelled of disinfectant and loneliness. She watched strangers come and go, men with tired eyes, women carrying plastic bags instead of purses. No one looked at anyone else. For the first time in her life, Clara understood what it meant to be invisible. One morning, she walked to the post office to check for mail from the insurance company. The clerk barely glanced at her before handing her a single envelope, a preliminary report. Her house, it stated, was a total loss. Reconstruction could take months. The sum of her payout seemed large on paper, but when she calculated costs, it barely covered the basics. She folded the letter neatly, slipped it into her purse, and stepped outside into the biting wind. Snow was falling again, thick and silent. Clara pulled her coat tighter and began walking without direction. Her boots sank into the drifts, and soon she realized she had wandered beyond the town limits. The road narrowed into a country path lined with bare trees. Her breath came out in white clouds. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't bear to return to that motel room, to the empty air of her temporary life. The path curved, and in the distance she saw a figure approaching. At first it looked like part of the storm, a dark shape moving slowly against the snow. Then it took form. A woman, wrapped in layers of wool, pulling a small cart behind her. As they drew closer, Clara recognized the steady gait, the upright posture. It was Agnes Harding. For a moment, Clara froze. The memory of her own mocking words came rushing back, the disdain, the laughter. She wanted to turn around, to hide, but Agnes had already seen her. The old woman stopped a few paces away, her breath visible in the air. Her face, weathered and red from the cold, softened with recognition. "Mrs. Mason?" Her voice was calm, almost kind. "Out walking in this weather?" Clara tried to answer, but her voice caught. My house burned down." The words sounded unreal even to her. "I don't have anywhere to go right now." Agnes looked at her for a long moment, her gray eyes steady. Then she nodded toward the cart. "Come with me. It's too cold to be standing out here." Clara shook her head instinctively. No, I'll be fine. I'm staying somewhere. I just needed air." But Agnes's gaze didn't waver. "Air won't keep you warm. Come, I've got a fire going." There was no command in her tone, only quiet certainty. Clara hesitated. Pride flared a last fragile piece of it, but the wind cut through her coat, and her hands were numb. Without another word, she fell into step beside the old woman. The snow creaked under their boots as they followed the narrow path toward the mountainside. The walk was longer than she expected. The trees closed in, their branches heavy with snow. And then, through the falling flakes, she saw it. The stone house. Up close, it looked even older, half buried in the hillside, smoke curling from the crooked chimney. The windows glowed faintly, golden against the gray sky. She felt a strange twist in her chest, a mixture of dread and longing. Agnes pushed open the heavy wooden door. The hinges groaned, releasing a rush of warm air scented with wood smoke, and something faintly sweet-dried herbs, perhaps. Inside, the walls were rough stone, uneven, but solid. A small fire burned in the hearth, its light flickering across shelves lined with jars and books. A kettle hummed softly. "Sit," Agnes said simply, gesturing to a wooden chair near the fire. "You look half frozen," Clara obeyed, lowering herself onto the chair. Her fingers tingled painfully as they thawed. She looked around the room, absorbing its strangeness. There was no order here, not in the way she understood it. The furniture was mismatched, the floor scattered with woven rugs of different patterns. And yet, somehow, it all belonged together. There was harmony in the clutter, a sense of life that no polished surface could hold. Agnes poured tea into 2 chipped cups and handed one to her. "Chamomile," she said. "It helps when the world gets noisy." Clara accepted it awkwardly, murmuring thanks. The tea was hot, the scent earthy. She took a sip and felt it spread warmth through her chest. "Stay here tonight," Agnes said after a while. "It's no weather for traveling. You can have the spare room. It's small, but the blankets are thick." Clara shook her head. "I couldn't possibly. I wouldn't want to be a burden." Agnes gave a quiet smile. "You'd be doing me a favor. It gets lonely in winter." There was something in her tone that disarmed Clara completely. The resistance melted before she could rebuild it. "Just for one night," she said, more to herself than to the old woman. "That's all right," Agnes replied, tending to the fire. "One night at a time." Later, lying in the small room beneath the slanted ceiling, Clara listened to the wind whistle outside. The walls creaked softly, but the house felt solid, as if the mountain itself was holding it together. The scent of smoke clung to her hair, but this time it didn't bring fear. It brought comfort. For the first time since the fire, she slept. And somewhere in the half-light of that sleep, between dream and waking, she thought she heard a faint whisper from the stone walls. Not words, but a kind of breathing, as if the house itself were alive, welcoming her. She turned beneath the quilt and drifted deeper into the warmth, unaware that the woman she had once ridiculed would soon become the keeper of her salvation. When morning came, Clara woke to the faint crackle of firewood and the smell of bread. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. The ceiling above her was low and slanted, the walls rough with age, and light filtered through a small window carved into the stone. Then it came back to her. The snowstorm, the long walk, Agnes's calm voice saying, "You'd be doing me a favor." She sat up slowly, feeling the heavy weight of the quilt slide off her shoulders. The air was cool, but not cold. The stone walls, touched by the warmth of the fire, seemed to hum with quiet life. When she stepped into the main room, Agnes was already up, stirring something in a blackened pot over the hearth. The old woman turned and smiled with that same mild certainty that seemed to require no effort. "Morning, dear. Sit. It's porridge. Nothing fancy." Clara sat down at the small table, embarrassed by the softness in her own voice when she said thank you. The chair creaked beneath her, and the fire's light painted slow-moving shadows along the uneven walls. There was no clock ticking, no hum of appliances, no background noise at all, just the occasional sigh of the wind outside and the gentle murmur of the kettle. It made her uneasy at first. Silence had always been the thing she filled with lists and tasks. Here, it surrounded her, patient and complete. Agnes poured 2 bowls and sat opposite her. "You sleep all right?" "Yes," Clara answered. "Better than I expected." "That's good. Houses remember kindness, you know. They settle differently when they've got someone under their roof." Clara didn't know what to say to that. She simply nodded, spooning the porridge in small bites. The taste was simple, warm, slightly sweet from honey. She was surprised by how much it comforted her. After breakfast, she offered to help with chores. Agnes accepted without fuss, and together they went outside. The air was sharp and clean, the kind that burned the lungs in a way that felt almost purifying. Snow draped the hillside like a quilt, and beyond the ridge, mist curled between the pines. Clara followed Agnes to the woodshed, where they gathered logs and stacked them by the door. The older woman moved with a grace that defied her age, her hands strong and sure. By midday, Clara's arms ached, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the pain. She hadn't done such work in years, maybe ever. At her own house, everything had been convenient heat at the turn of a dial, water with the twist of a handle. Here, each bit of warmth was earned, each comfort touched by labor. When they paused to rest, Agnes poured hot tea from a thermos and said, "It's not about how much you have. It's about what you care for. The house takes what you give it and gives it back when you need it." Clara thought she was speaking figuratively, but later that evening, when the fire burned low, she began to believe there was something literal in those words. The house was different from any she had ever known. The walls absorbed warmth and gave it back slowly, like breathing. If she pressed her palm to the stone, she could feel a faint throb, almost like a heartbeat. She told herself it was just imagination, the play of fire and draft. But even in her most logical thoughts, she sensed something alive in the way the shadows moved across the rock. Days passed, blending into one another. The routines of the house became her routines, waking with the first light, fetching water from the nearby spring, feeding the chickens that roamed near the fence, stacking wood before dusk. At night, they sat by the fire, drinking tea or simply watching the flames. Agnes spoke little, but when she did, her stories came like threads pulled from deep time memories of the valley when it was young, of winters that had tested everyone, of the man who had built this house stone by stone. "He had hands that could read the rock," Agnes said one night. Said each stone had its own sound. You knock on it and listen. The good ones ring soft, like a promise. She looked into the fire. "He's been gone a long time, but I still hear the echo sometimes when I walk outside." Clara watched her, realizing how little she had ever listened to anyone before. In her old life, conversations were transactions. One gave, one received. But Agnes spoke as though the act of remembering was itself enough, not something that needed to be answered. Clara found herself relaxing into the silences between them. Winter deepened. The snow piled higher along the windows, and the world outside seemed to retreat into quiet. Letters from the insurance company arrived occasionally, left by the postman at the gate. Clara opened them by the fire, scanning the formal language that promised compensation and reconstruction schedules. Yet every time she read them, she felt a pang of doubt. The idea of returning to her perfect house no longer brought comfort. It seemed hollow now, stripped of meaning. One evening she decided to sweep the front room. The motion felt soothing, the slow rhythm of the broom, the whisper of straw against stone. As she worked, her gaze fell on a framed photograph above the mantel. A young man standing beside Agnes, both smiling, his arms slung protectively around her shoulder. He had the look of someone unafraid of life's weight. "Your husband?" Clara asked later, as they shared a pot of soup. Agnes nodded. "Yes, George Harding, stonemason. We built this place together. Well, he built. I carried. He died in an avalanche the year after the last room was finished." Her tone was even, not mournful. "Everyone told me to move into town. I couldn't. You see, this is his work. Every wall, every shelf. Leaving it would have been like burying him twice." Clara felt the words settle inside her. She looked around at the room, the uneven lines, the stones stacked with visible hands, not machines. There was something sacred in the imperfection. It made her think of her own house, the one rebuilt from blueprints and paid invoices. Every angle in it had been mathematically precise, yet lifeless. Here, every rough surface seemed to pulse with memory. Later that night, when Agnes had gone to bed, Clara sat alone by the dying fire. The house was still, but not silent. It creaked softly, as if settling its weight deeper into the earth. She thought again of Agnes's words. "Houses remember kindness." It sounded like superstition. Yet as she watched the firelight crawl along the stone, she felt seen, as though the place itself acknowledged her presence. She whispered softly, not even knowing why. "Thank you." The next morning, she woke before dawn and went outside. The air was brittle, stars fading into the pale blue of early light. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. She could hear Agnes humming somewhere near the barn. Clara knelt to clear snow from the path. The rhythm of work filled her with a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Her mind, always cluttered with planning and precision, felt quiet. By the end of the week, she began to notice other changes. Her hands, once manicured and soft, bore small calluses. Her cheeks had color again. She smiled without realizing it. The woman she saw in the mirror was different. Not better or worse, just real. Agnes noticed too. "You're finding your pace," she said simply. "Took me years to learn it. You're quicker." Clara wanted to protest, to deny that anything had changed, but she couldn't. She was different. The fire inside her that used to burn for control now burned for warmth, for belonging. The stillness that once frightened her now soothed her. And then came the letter that ended her peace. It arrived in a thick envelope with a familiar seal, the insurance company confirming that reconstruction of her house was nearly complete. She read it 3 times by the window, her breath fogging the glass. The words should have filled her with relief, but instead they stirred unease. The idea of returning to bright rooms and clean walls felt wrong, like stepping back into a shell that no longer fit. That night she didn't speak much. Agnes didn't ask questions. They sat together in the golden circle of firelight, while the wind howled beyond the walls. Finally, Agnes said quietly, "You'll go back soon, I suppose." Clara hesitated. "I should. It's my home." The old woman nodded, poking at the logs. "Maybe. Or maybe your home's wherever your heart learns to rest." Clara looked around the room, at the soft glow on the stone, the kettle steaming on the hearth, the slow heartbeat warmth that pulsed through the walls. She didn't answer. She couldn't. That night, when she finally lay down to sleep, she reached out to touch the wall beside her bed. The stone was warm beneath her palm, almost alive. She closed her eyes and thought she felt it breathe. A quiet exhale, like the sigh of someone watching over her. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to belong to something greater than herself, something not made by plans or rules, but by care. Outside, the storm deepened, and the house of stone held steady, rooted in its mountain like a guardian. Inside, Clara dreamed not of loss or order, but of light flickering against stone, of warmth earned by human hands. Somewhere, in the rhythm of the wind and fire, she began to find the sound of her own heart again. Spring came quietly to the valley, seeping through the cracks of melting snow and the branches that bent beneath it. It did not arrive all at once, but in gentle murmurs, a thawing drip from the roof, the cry of birds returning, the faint smell of damp soil waking beneath the frost. Clara stood by the window of Agnes's stone house and watched the first blades of green push through the white crust. She had been there long enough for winter to feel like another lifetime, and yet it had passed in a blink. She had stopped counting the days after the first month, measuring time instead by the woodpile's rise and fall, by how often she refilled the kettle or swept the hearth. Now, the idea of leaving made her chest feel strangely tight. The letter from the insurance company lay folded on the table. She had read it so many times that the paper had softened. "Repairs completed," it said. "Your property is ready for occupancy." A short sentence, precise and final, like something written for someone else. Each time she looked at it, she tried to summon the image of her house as it had been rebuilt. Fresh paint, smooth floors, shining windows, but it refused to appear. All she could see was the fire, and then, beyond that, the flickering glow of this room where she had found something she couldn't name. Agnes noticed her staring at the letter again and set down her cup. "You'll be going soon," she said. It wasn't a question, only an observation. "I suppose I should," Clara said, but her voice lacked conviction. "It's what I've been waiting for." Agnes smiled faintly. Waiting and wanting aren't the same. Clara wanted to argue, but the words didn't come. She turned back to the window. The stone beneath her fingers felt warm, though the air outside was still cold. "I never thanked you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For letting me stay. For everything." Agnes chuckled softly. "You needed a roof, and the house needed company. That's no favor. That's balance." The next morning, Clara packed. It didn't take long. Her life had shrunk to a few essentials. Agnes helped her wrap the last of her things in a wool blanket, the same one she'd been given the night of the storm. When the small bag was ready, they stood by the door for a moment, neither quite knowing what to say. Finally, Agnes touched her arm. "You'll come back," she said simply. "Everyone who belongs here does." Clara smiled at that, though her eyes stung. "Maybe," she said, "if you'll have me. I'll have the kettle waiting." The walk down to town felt longer than she remembered. The snow was melting, and water trickled in narrow streams along the path. She could hear the soft crunch of thawing earth under her boots. The landscape seemed both familiar and foreign, as if she were walking through a place she had known once, but only from dreams. When her house came into view, her steps slowed. It stood almost exactly as it had before, the fire-white fence newly painted, roof mended, windows gleaming. Looked perfect. Too perfect. The symmetry she had once prized now felt sterile. She crossed the yard and unlocked the door, the new key smooth and cold in her hand. The hinges squealed slightly as the door opened, and the smell of paint and plaster greeted her. Everything was new, but it was not alive. Her footsteps echoed as she walked through the rooms. The kitchen counters shone, untouched. The living room held a brand new armchair that matched the catalog image she had chosen without care. She tried to imagine sitting there, reading, drinking tea, but the thought fell flat. The silence here was hollow, not peaceful. That first night she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the whisper of the wind outside. The house was warm, but she felt cold. Her thoughts drifted back to the stone walls of Agnes's home. to the fire that breathed like a living heart, to the scent of herbs and the sound of the old woman humming. She missed the creak of wood, the murmur of the kettle, even the uneven rhythm of Agnes's steps. This silence wasn't rest. It was absence. In the morning, she opened every curtain to let the light in, but it didn't help. The sunlight seemed pale here, stretched thin. She made tea, but it tasted of metal. She sat by the window, watching a crow hop along the fence, and realized she hadn't seen anyone smile at her since she left the mountain. People in town nodded politely when she passed, the way they always had, but now she could feel the space between those gestures, the polite emptiness of it all. Her chest ached with something that wasn't quite loneliness, more like displacement. She was a guest in her own life. By the third day, she stopped pretending she was adjusting. She took her coat from the peg and stepped outside. The air smelled faintly of thawing earth and wood smoke faint, but enough to stir something deep in her. She began to walk. The road to the mountain was muddy, the snow melting into rivulets that soaked through her boots. She didn't rush. She let her feet find their pace, the way Agnes had taught her when they carried wood together. Each step felt like peeling away a layer of silence. By the time she reached the familiar bend in the path, she was breathing hard, and the wind had tangled her hair. She didn't care. When the house came into view, smoke was already curling from the chimney. The sight filled her with a rush of relief so strong it almost hurt. She hesitated at the gate, suddenly uncertain, but before she could decide whether to knock, the door opened. Agnes stood there, wrapped in her shawl, smiling as if she had been expecting her. "I brought you tea," Clara said, holding up the small tin she had carried all the way from town. "Then you'd better come in before it cools," Agnes said. The warmth of the fire hit her as soon as she stepped inside. The house looked exactly as it had the day she left. The same mismatched chairs, the same rug by the hearth, the same smell of wood and herbs. It was as if time here had moved differently, slower, kinder. Agnes motioned for her to sit while she filled the kettle. They didn't speak for a while. The crackling of the fire was enough. When the tea was ready, they sat side by side, cups steaming in their hands. Clara felt something unclench inside her, something she hadn't even realized had been tight. The stone walls glowed softly in the firelight, and for the first time in days, she breathed easily. "I thought I'd feel at home again," she said quietly, "in that new house. But it isn't home. It's just walls and windows. Everything works, but nothing lives." Agnes nodded. "You can rebuild a house," she said, "but a home is something you grow. Takes time, takes heart." Clara looked into her cup, watching the thin swirl of steam rise and fade. "This place feels alive," she said after a moment. "I used to think that was just a way of speaking, but now I'm not sure." Agnes smiled, lines deepening around her eyes. "Oh, it's alive. It remembers everyone who's ever needed it. And it never forgets kindness. You gave it some of yours." Clara thought of the nights she had sat by this fire, of the mornings when frost sparkled on the windows and the smell of bread filled the air. "It gave it back," she said softly. Outside, the sky was dimming to the soft gray of early evening. The first flakes of late snow began to fall, spiraling lazily through the air. Inside, the warmth deepened. They ate a simple supper bread, cheese, and the last of the winter preserves, and when they were done, Agnes leaned back in her chair with a sigh. "There now," she said. "You see, the world doesn't end. It just changes shape." Clara smiled faintly. "And what shape is this?" "Peace," Agnes said. "You've found a bit of it. Don't lose it again." Later that night, after Agnes had gone to bed, Clara sat by the fire alone. She listened to the wind brushing against the door, to the slow settling of the stones. The shadows on the walls moved gently, alive with the flicker of the flames. She reached out and touched the stone beside her. It was warm again, as though it recognized her hand. She whispered, "I'm home." And for once, the words didn't feel like an effort or a lie. She stayed there until the fire burned low, watching the last embers fade into a soft glow. The snow outside thickened, muffling every sound. The valley would wake, covered in white again, but the thaw would return, as it always did. She thought of her old house down in the town, standing pristine and silent, and she realized she no longer felt guilty for leaving it behind. That house had been a chapter. This was the rest of the story. When she finally went to bed, the warmth of the stone seemed to follow her, wrapping around her like breath. In the darkness, she heard the faint creak of Agnes's footsteps in the next room and the steady whisper of the wind beyond the walls. The house held it all, the fire's fading heart, the voices of two women, the echo of years gone by, and it seemed to sigh with them, alive and content. By morning, the snow would cover every path again, erasing all traces of her return. But it didn't matter. The way back was already written inside her, in the quiet rhythm of her heart that now beat in time with the breathing of the mountain and the pulse of the house of stone and light. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. There are many more stories waiting for you. Watch the next video and discover what comes after. And if this one moved you, share it with someone who loves meaningful stories. Your support helps these stories reach more hearts.